Let's go. All right. Welcome, everyone, to our first official lecture of U.S. History 1302. So this chapter is chapter 18, the New South and the Trans-Mississippi West. And I said this off camera, I'll say it on camera. I think the chapter titles are a little obtuse. And they're a little too long and a little too wordy. And whoever was writing the chapter titles was like, I'm so clever as they wrote it. And anyways, it's kind of silly. All right, so last week, kind of before the course started, we were discussing Reconstruction. And we kind of talked about Reconstruction in detail. But let's just zoom out for a moment and let's think real quick about what the South must have been like after the Civil War, okay? It was a complete and total change in society from top to bottom. First, let's talk about just the physical geography of the South. Entire cities were burnt down to the ground like Atlanta, okay? Railroads, bridges, infrastructure destroyed as the Union armies fought against the Confederacy, okay? The stock of young white men in the Confederacy is depleted, okay? Towards the end of the war, they are drafting teenagers and old men to fight for the Confederacy because they ran out of young men, okay, in their 18, 20s, okay? Right? Towards the end of the war, it is so desperate, okay, that, they are even thinking about putting slaves in the Confederate Army to defend slavery. That's how desperate they got towards the end. The Confederate leadership, they had every reason to believe that they would be rounded up and hung at the end of the war, okay? And surprisingly, most Confederate soldiers and most Confederate politicians and most Confederate generals did not. Reconstruction, partly because of Andrew Johnson, the Democratic president in the middle of Reconstruction, he pardoned a lot of them. But because Reconstruction got really messy politically, a lot of the Southerners just get off. Okay, even Jefferson Davis gets pardoned, and he was like the president of the Confederacy. You would think if anyone got arrested or executed, it would be him. Robert E. Lee, he actually lives a successful life after the Civil War. He ends up becoming the president of Washington University, which is now called Washington and Lee University, and he successfully runs the university and helps the South transition into peacetime. Okay, he's one of the big figures in getting the war to, getting people to not go off and fight in guerrilla warfare. And the North has reasons to believe that the Southerners, they're going to just keep fighting until they're all hunted down and killed. But Abraham Lincoln, at the beginning, he has a plan to be gentle with the South. And radical Republicans, they want to be harsh. And Andrew Johnson, he is somewhere in the middle. He wants to punish the planter class, but to forgive the average ordinary Southerner. And there's a lot of tension in Reconstruction that we talked about last week that leads to kind of a messy period of time. Socially, the whole structure of the South is upended with the abolition of slavery, okay? Now, slavery is a bad thing. It was evil and it oppressed and hurt, millions of people for almost, we have 2 centuries from the 1600s to the 1800s. But slavery was the basis of the society. Their economy was based off of slave-based labor. So the whole economy, the whole society, politics, everything shifts, okay? All right, and it is shifted very dramatically and radically in just a few years. And then you think about African Americans, their whole world changes. There's freedom, but with that freedom comes new risks and challenges, okay? And so the whole South has to be rebuilt. And the South has lagged behind the rest of the country. While the Civil War did have a few battles in northern states, most notably Antietam and Gettysburg, most of the destruction was in the South, okay? Now, this right here, it may be covered up by the recording, but this is a map of railroads right around after the Civil War ends, okay? If you look at the railroads, they're the red line. Someone tell me, just based off of this map, where do most people live in America? In the Northeast, okay? All right, when we talk about regions, okay, sometimes the geography in America can be confusing. And that, I think, is partially because America expanded. But when we talk about the North, it usually doesn't include like Washington and Montana, okay? That's the West. Everything kind of west of the Mississippi River, we think of as the West, okay? The Northeast is kind of Pennsylvania upwards towards Maine. That's the Northeast. The South generally refers to the former states of the Confederacy, okay? Now, when you go to the West, we have like the Northwest and the Southwest, okay? But there's also this group area called the Midwest, and you've probably heard about that. The Midwest is around the Great Lakes, okay? So this is like Illinois, Iowa, Michigan, Indiana, Ohio. This is like the Midwest states, okay? Which used to be just the West. Like when America first got started right after the Revolution, the West was Illinois. That was like the frontier, you know? And so they call this the Midwest. So the North, Northeast, and the Midwest, that's where most people live in America, okay? Just based off of railroads. And these railroads, they're not just transporting people, they're transporting goods. They're transporting resources. The industry of the United States is in the Northeast. The factories, the technology, the railroads. The North is incredibly ahead of the South. Meanwhile, the South is an agricultural economy based off of cash crops like cotton, okay? Now, the thing about cotton is that you can't eat it, okay? You can make clothing out of it. People need clothing, but you can't just live off of cotton. So the South is constantly interacting with markets, okay? It's export-based economy. They export their cotton all across the world to Europe and other countries, and they export it to the north, to northern factories, and they use the money that they make off of those cotton sales to buy everything else basically that they need. Meanwhile, in the north, there are farms, but those farms tend to grow like foodstuffs, like wheat and corn. And in the north, there's a lot of manufacturing, so the north is much more self-sufficient than the south, which also means that the South is more vulnerable to like economic crises across the world. But the South doesn't care a lot about manufacturing interests because they're an agricultural based economy. And so there's kind of this effect where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, okay? When you have a factory and a railroad, you're gonna be producing stuff and making more stuff and you're gonna make money. And so then that factory is going to bring in people to live at the factory. Well, when people live at that factory, you're going to have, or near the factory, you're going to have housing developments. So that means there's going to be construction jobs. When you got construction jobs, those construction workers have to go eat, right? So there's going to be, taverns and restaurants for them to eat, and grocery stores, right? When there's grocery stores, then you got to have employees for the grocery stores, okay? And those grocery store employees, they got to have housing, and they've got to have food, and they've got to have jobs. And so you see how like the economy can build off of each other. Like one industry can create other industries that piggyback off of it, okay? If like one person becomes a millionaire, they're going to be able to hire people to have jobs. And those people who have jobs are going to spend their money, and that's going to create jobs elsewhere, okay? And so what happens is that in the north, you start to see more and more development. You start to see cities. You start to see more and new manufacturing, more and new economic development. But that makes it difficult for the South to get any development themselves, okay? Because they don't have the infrastructure. They don't have the pool. What's the point of building a factory in the South if you're not going to make any money off it? If there's no housing for your factory workers, why should you build a factory there? If there's no infrastructure and roads and railroads to support it, why should you build a factory there? The South lags behind. Why should you have a railroad if there's nothing that's going to be shipped on the railroad? You don't just build a road to nowhere, okay? So people in the South have to decide how they're going to rebuild. And we're talking about it politically. By the end of 1877, or by 1877, when Rutherford B. Hayes becomes president, okay, he agreed in his bargain for the presidency in the 1876 election. And we talked about this a little bit last week, but he agreed as a Republican to remove the soldiers out of the South and let the South reorganize their own governments and rejoin the Union. Okay, so Reconstruction ended in 1877. So in those 12 years between the Civil War and the end of Reconstruction, a lot of it had been rebuilt. The governments had been reestablished and laws had been passed to protect African American civil rights. But all of that was about to change. When the federal troops leave and there's nobody behind to make sure that people do what they're supposed to do, there is lots of opportunities for problems, okay? Lots of opportunities for problems, okay? One of the first things we need to talk about is the redemption of the South. The redemption is what they called the moments when segregation is established and civil rights for African Americans are curtailed. It's when the white Southerners take back control of their old governments. As long as there were federal Union troops patrolling in the South, there was more protection for African Americans. African Americans got their freedom with the 13th Amendment. They got their citizenship and protection of equal rights under the 14th Amendment. And African American men got the right to vote under the 15th Amendment. But this did not last forever, okay? Once the soldiers are gone, white Southerners start to fight back. There was a time in the Reconstruction that actually you have like multiple senators and representatives in Congress that are African American, and in state governments across the South, there's a lot of African American participation. But when the troops leave, whites get back to taking things under their control, okay? So there's a lot of what we call basically extracurricular, or not extracurricular, but like extra legal pressure, okay? Not just the government, but we're talking about terrorist organizations, okay? White Southerners start to organize, and not all of them, but large numbers of them start to organize in secret societies, things like White Leagues or the Ku Klux Klan, that use violence and intimidation to scare African Americans from exercising their rights. Okay, all right, if a black man tries to vote, a white man sees him, they'll follow him home, figure out where he lives, and then at night, come to his house, set a cross on fire in the front yard, and say, you try that again, we'll kill you, okay, or maybe they just go ahead and kill him. Okay, lynching becomes increasingly common. Lynching, Lynching, lynching is the like execution by mob. Okay, typically they would hang them, okay, but they did all sorts of nasty stuff to African Americans to scare and terrify the population of African Americans from trying to exercise their rights, okay? White Southerners, we talked about this before, during the time of slavery, there was this facade of paternalism that white people were taking care of black people as their slaves. But when black people are elevated to equal status with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, white people drop that facade, and Southerners start to do everything they can to keep African Americans under their thumb, economically, politically, socially, etc. We'll talk about the economic stuff on one of the later slides about sharecropping. But right now, I just want to talk about it politically, okay? Voting is your clear, obvious way to influence the government. That is like the basic principle on which democracy is built. If you can't vote, the other rights aren't that important, okay? Okay, because you have to have a right, you have the ability to make a difference with your vote. To keep African Americans from voting, violence is used, threats, okay? Lots of African Americans are killed, lots of them are beaten, lots of them are terrified, okay? And the way that this fear works is that it actually leads to like some self-policing, okay? African Americans, once several of them are, killed and murdered and, terrorized, the idea of self-preservation kicks in, don't do this. Don't get yourself in trouble. Don't break these rules or you'll get killed. Okay. And with this pressure, you see the number of African Americans in Congress, in the government, decreasing. And you see an increase of white Southerners and former Confederates getting their right to vote back after the Civil War, and they start making some changes to their governments. Now, the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. We know this from Article 6 of the Constitution. So the state governments cannot just pass a law that violates the Constitution openly. They cannot pass a law that says black people can't vote. They cannot pass a law that takes away black people's right to vote directly. So they have to be sneaky, okay? Words matter. Word choice matters, especially in law, okay? So African Americans can't be prevented from voting. But what if we only let people vote if they knew how to read? Okay, I mean, that might make sense. Who wants uneducated morons voting? You know, should we, and there's probably some people today in this world, in, big tech companies that probably think that, we shouldn't just let people say whatever they want on Facebook or Twitter. You can only say things if it follows our terms and service. You have to be, we don't want just anybody being able to talk and voice their opinions. There are those elitist ideas still today, and there are some people who think, yeah, only educated people should vote because they know better, and that does not necessarily seem racist right off the top. But when you understand the context, most African American slaves were not allowed to read. They were not allowed to write, okay? So if you make it illegal to vote unless you can prove that you can read and write, then you can stop a lot of African Americans from voting. And these literacy tests that they started to create were often not just, can you read and write, okay? These were extensive tests about American civics, okay? You can look up a literacy test from the era of segregation, and like the questions they asked, it'd be like essay questions. It's like the questions that I put on my test, okay? But here's the thing, they're like essay questions, and there are lots of them, and they're very difficult. And you know who's going to grade the test? A white person. So even if you had an extremely educated black person, like someone who had studied the Constitution and was like a scholar, they could probably take the test and still fail because it's an essay test and it's subjective. If it's a multiple choice, A, B, C, or D, one of them is right and the others are wrong. But in an essay, there is wiggle room, It's subjective. So this is a way to effectively stop black people from voting, but there's a catch. Anyone want to guess the catch? Who else will be prevented from voting by literacy tests?
South.
South who?
Farmers.
Yeah, like poor white people, poor farmers that they can't pass a test like that. Okay, well, hold on to that thought. How are those people going to get to vote? They also do this thing called poll taxes, which were not unconstitutional until the 24th Amendment. Okay, poll taxes were taxes that you had to pay to vote. So whenever you go vote, you have to pay this tax or else you can't vote. So again, a lot of African Americans, they're sharecroppers, they're just freed from slavery. They don't have a lot of extra cash to pay a tax to vote. So that's going to prevent them from voting too. But what about poor white people that are uneducated? How do we let them vote but not black people? Well, let me introduce you to grandfather clauses. Okay, you might have heard this phrase before. They were grandfathered in. You ever heard someone say something like that? Like this was grandfathered in. Let me give you an example. Okay, in the city of Como, we have an ordinance against the installation of trailer houses. Okay, you cannot put a trailer house in the city of Como, but there are trailer houses in the city of Como. That's because they've been grandfathered in. They were in Como before the ordinance was passed. So we're not just gonna make those people who already have trailer houses in Como move, okay? But just no more, okay?
Wait, what about the trailer parks?
Trailer parks are an exception, okay? You can only have a trailer house in trailer park, okay? You can't just like put a trailer house. The reason behind that is it drives the property prices down for everyone else. When you're a homeowner, one of your biggest investments in your life is your home, okay? And the value of your home is related to your personal wealth. And so if you have a nice house, and then right next door, there's a trailer house that's run down and doesn't look that good, it could devalue your nice house, because when you try to sell it, people are gonna look at your house and they'll look at the neighbors and they're like, I wanna buy your house because I don't want those neighbors, okay? But anyway, they passed an ordinance several years ago, but that grandfather phrase, if something is already there, it's exempt. Grandfather clauses, that phrase comes from grandfather clauses, which said, you do not have to take this test, or you do not have to pay this tax if your grandfather voted in an election. So if you have a grandpa that voted in an election, you don't have to pay the tax, you don't have to take the test. Now, riddle me this. It's 1880, presidential election. Whose grandpa, so if someone that's like, 30 years old in 1880, they're born in 1850, okay? They're trying to go vote in this election. Whose grandpas were black people voting in 1880? Like, who were their grandparents? What were their grandparents doing? Slaves. So do you think they could vote? No. But the white people could be eligible because their grandparents would have been voting back in the 1850s, 1840s, and they would have been fine. Okay? So grandfather clauses were effectively used along with poll taxes and literacy tests to basically legislate African Americans away from being able to vote while narrowly avoiding the 15th Amendment. Technically, they're not stopping black people from voting. They're stopping people from voting that can't read or can't pay the tax or can't pay the test, pass the test, who also don't have grandparents who voted in an election. So it's like really wiggledy, complicated, and they're just trying to keep black people from voting, but they're not saying that they're keeping black people from voting. And so that's how they narrowly avoided the illegality of the situation. So once they set those laws up, it becomes very easy for white people to basically do whatever they want with the law. And so there's a quick creation of things called black codes, okay? Black codes basically formalize segregation. Segregation is basically laws that separate the races, keeping white people on top and African Americans on the bottom, okay? Now, this system survived for about 100 years, from the 1870s to the 1960s and 1970s, okay? Within 20 years, every southern state had enacted segregation as law. The early laws legalized segregation in trains and other public conveyances where black and whites were likely to mingle, okay? There's a complex web of what they call Jim Crow laws, drew an indelible color line in prisons, parks, hotels, restaurants, hospitals, and virtually all public gathering places except for streets and stores, which a lot of times those places had rules that said, like, black people had to get out of white people's way on the streets, had to, like, white people could cut in line, all that stuff, okay? Now, Jim Crow, the term Jim Crow comes from the old black minstrels. I wonder if I have a picture of it, or, yeah. So the Jim Crow laws, they come from the old black minstrel shows, okay? So there's a lot of racial stereotypes of black people, okay? And there's a lot of racism towards black people during this period of time, okay? A lot of this is based off of some erroneous thoughts and feelings about black people, okay? White people had been trained for generations to believe that black people were inferior to them, that they were only valuable as slaves. They weren't as smart as white people. They weren't as hardworking as white people. They were lazy and bad and prone to doing bad things. And that's why they had to be enslaved. There was a lot of argument behind slavery. And those arguments made slavery seem like it was a positive good. Like they were trying to justify slavery, saying this is what black people need. They need to be enslaved because if they're off to their own devices, it'll be just disaster. Okay. Now that slavery has been abolished, those ideas evolve into black people need laws and rules to keep them in control. Otherwise, they're just going to run wild and just take everything away from white people. Okay. So the Freedmen's Bureau is attacked. As you know, remember the Freedmen's Bureau, that was an organization trying to help black people get their start out after they were freed. The Freedmen's Bureau gets attacked by Southerners as an agency of evil, okay? And they really honestly attack black people as though they're evil, okay? We're gonna read this. Now, obviously, this is a racist image. And obviously, this is an image that many people might find disturbing. And there's language in here that is stuff that you don't typically say in normal conversation. But as historians, it is our obligation to look at the past without washing away the parts that make us uncomfortable, okay? Because otherwise we don't get a full picture. So we have to stare at the ugly things to understand what's going on, okay? So this is a newspaper advertisement, okay? This, I believe this is a newspaper advertisement. This is anti-African-American propaganda. And this is pro-white supremacy propaganda, keeping whites supreme over the South, okay? The Freedmen's Bureau, an agency to keep the Negro in idleness at the expense of the white man, twice vetoed by the president and made a law by Congress. So support Congress and you support the Negro, sustain the president, and you protect the white man. This is from when Andrew Johnson was president. Andrew Johnson, he was anti-African-American civil rights. He wanted to punish the Southern planters more out of personal rivalry, but he didn't really want to help African-Americans during Reconstruction. Congress overrode him during radical Reconstruction to help African-Americans out. But a lot of people thought, a lot of white Southerners think that now these African-Americans are free, they just want to live life and take all our stuff away. They want to take our land away from us and give it to black people so they can just do nothing. It's like, it's really twisted logic, but the idea is that like white people, a lot of these, they just saw black people as lazy, as just take, and then use the white man for their own good. So you look at this cartoon and you see a caricature of a black person with stereotyped features, okay? It's like making him look, you know, grotesque, okay? But you got him, he's laying down doing nothing. The Freedmen's Bureau is just giving him all the stuff. Meanwhile, the white man has to work. And the black people, they can just do whatever they want, okay? So this is obviously propaganda. It's obviously wrong. But this is like the attitude in the South, is that these black people are just running amok. You know, just voting and going to the store and riding on trains and sitting next to white people. It's a disaster, okay? But they quickly pass laws to stop things like this from happening, okay? Jim Crow comes from the name of an old black minstrel show. So I totally got sidetracked. But Jim Crow was the name of a black minstrel show, and black minstrel shows were like comedy acts, like you go to the theater, right? Or like a little cart comes through town and somebody gets out and does a little street performance. But it's not like a normal play. It's like white people dressed in blackface, acting stupid to like make fun of black people. Does that make sense? Okay. It's like white people painting their skin black and like acting like they're this exaggerated, dumb black person that, you know, white people laugh around like, haha, that's funny, you know. And Jim Crow was one of the most famous of those. So like Jim Crow became a term for like just talking about black people. And so Jim Crow laws eventually became synonymous with segregation, keeping white and black people separate, okay? So And eventually in this class, I'm going to show you a clip of a movie called Birth of a Nation, which actually depicts like this period of time and like the redemption of the South, but from like a pro-segregation perspective. It's really weird, but it has a lot of the same sort of imagery in it. Anyways, but you might be thinking, how could a law separate black people and white people on a train? How could a law separate black and white people in society? Doesn't the 14th Amendment provide for all people in America to be citizens with equal protection under the law? You might be thinking that in your head. You're like, I know that this violates the Constitution. Why didn't they do anything about it? Well, they did. If you remember, in our government, there are three branches. There's Congress, the legislative branch, the president, the executive branch, and the Supreme Court, or the judicial branch. Congress makes the laws, the president executes the laws, and the Supreme Court interprets laws and interprets the Constitution. Any law passed in the United States has to follow the Constitution. If a law violates the Constitution, it is unconstitutional. Okay? If it's unconstitutional, the Supreme Court can declare it so and nullify that law and get rid of it. Okay? So if you remember, when we talked about one of the very first Supreme Court cases last semester, Marbury versus Madison, okay, the Supreme Court established that power of judicial review, and there was a law that they said does not follow the Constitution. They just got rid of it. They just wrote it off the books, okay? But that can happen with any law if the Supreme Court so finds it. So the Supreme Court has the power to overturn these segregation laws. But the Supreme Court is a reactive branch of the government. Okay? They can't just go seek out a law. Does that make sense? The law has to be challenged in court, and then it has to work its way up through the courts. Okay? If it never gets challenged, it never gets overturned. So people started planning, African American civil rights leaders, African Americans who don't like the way the country's going, they don't like Jim Crow, they start planning ways to overturn it. And one of those people is a man named Homer Plessy. Homer Plessy is famous for the case of Plessy v. Ferguson. Now, when I tell the story in the simple manner, it goes a little bit like this. Homer Plessy was African-American man. He bought a first-class ticket to a train. He got on the train in the first-class ticket space, and he was told to move to the back of the train. He refused. He gets arrested. He challenges segregation. But that is the simple and short version, which is accurate, but there's a few more details that I want to share with you. First off, Plessy v. Ferguson is often depicted, Homer Plessy is often depicted like this, okay? You know, as a more stereotypically black person. Homer Plessy was actually part white, okay? I believe that he was 1/8 African American. Don't quote me on that. But he is only partially black, okay? But a lot of these Jim Crow laws, they actually like specified like how many black ancestors do you have to be black? And I believe it was like 1/8. So like if you had like one great grandparent that was black, you were black. I believe that, and it varied from place to place, okay? But like someone who is half black and half white, they're black under the black codes, okay? Anyways, so this Homer Plessy, okay, if you look at him, you might notice that, you know, he could possibly pass for a white person, okay? Now, maybe not, but he's not, this is not this, okay? All right, they, you know, when they drew it in the newspapers and they talked about it, people had no idea, okay? Anyways, and Homer Plessy does this on purpose. It's not like he's just decided to get on a train one day and ride in the first class. He like did it on purpose because he knew that breaking segregation could get you into problems in two different ways. Typically, if an African American challenged segregation, let's say they tried to vote, let's say they stood up to white people oppressing them, they would face typically legal punishment for breaking the laws, and then extra legal punishment from organizations like the Ku Klux Klan, terrorist organizations that would attack in the night. Okay, all right. So you could get in trouble in jail, and then your family could all get murdered in the middle of the night because you challenged segregation. So this is not something that people would just do accidentally. It's not like they would just accidentally break segregation laws. Like African Americans were well aware of the danger. Okay, and so Homer Plessy does this on purpose. Okay, and he agrees to test a Louisiana law requiring segregated railroad facilities by sitting in the all-white section of a local train. He is promptly arrested, and he challenges he's arrested for breaking the law, but he challenges it. His defense is not, I didn't break the law. His defense is the law is unconstitutional, okay? Whenever you get like in trouble in court, most of the time, people's defense is, I didn't do the bad thing, okay? On occasion, sometimes you say, I did that, but it wasn't bad because the law is bad. And that's Homer Plessy's argument. And it works its way up to the Supreme Court. Homer Plessy argues that he is a citizen of the United States according to the 14th Amendment, and he is entitled to equal protection under the law. He had the money, he bought a first-class ticket, he should have equal accommodations in public services, and first-class ticket means first class. He can pay for a first-class ticket, he should get to ride in the first-class section of the train, not the back of the train, okay? This argument goes up to the Supreme Court. It takes several years. So the actual ride happened in 1892. 1896 is when it goes to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is led by, I believe it was Roger Taney at that point, maybe different, I don't know. Anyways, the Supreme Court argues, or they hear the arguments about it, and we'll pick up there tomorrow, okay? You guys have a great day. Do good things, be good people, make good choices. Let's see what happens to Homer Plessy tomorrow, all right? I turned the camera down. Y'all can freely walk.